Greetings and welcome to the first video on the Allodium channel. So this first video is going to be what is Allodium. So Allodium is a word that has a definition. Its etymological origins are in kind of the Middle Ages in Germany, France region, representing an allode, which would be a territory of land that an individual or family unit has absolute right to, with no overlord. So at the same time in history was the rise of feudalism. So feudalism is that all of the land and all of the people have a singular overlord. And each overlord has another overlord, and it all goes up to the Pope, who's the top overlord, and rules over all of the people and all of the land and all of the domains within that culture of domination. So Allodium essentially represents the antithesis of feudalism. So it represents the decentralized as opposed to the centralized, the people without any overlord as opposed to the system of absolute domination, and absolute rights and ownership of the property through the defense and occupation. So that is the definition of the word allodium: owned absolutely by occupation and defense without an overlord. So I established my allodium here. All of the property that you see here is my allodium. And what that means is all of this property here is owned absolutely by occupation and defense without any overlord. So at no point in time in establishing my property upon the land here have I acknowledged or paid fealty or due to any overlord, be that state, county, federal, town, family, anything. What does it take to establish your allodium? Well, if you have a sword and you claim that sword as your absolute property, and then someone else bigger and stronger than you says, "That's my sword now, give it up or I'm going to kill you." If you give it up, it's not yours. If you say, "How about I give you $10 instead?" it's not yours. If you say, "Well, I'll acknowledge that you're the local person in these other realms, if only I can keep my sword," it's not your allodium. The only way that sword is your allodium. So allodium doesn't just relate to like land, like a lot, which we'll get into that. Also, the difference between land and property, because land is not property. Even though people think property is land and land is property, that's not true. That's a lie. You've just been convinced of a fiction. So this sword, if you say, "No, you can't have my sword, you'll have to fight me to try to take it to the death, and I have the absolute right to this sword, you have no claim to it," then that sword is your allodium. Same with the clothes on your back. If a big strong person comes with a gun and says, "Take off your shirt or I'm going to kill you," the shirt's only your allodium if you occupy it and defend it and you don't acknowledge any authority over it. Then it's your allodium. So to establish your allodium relative to a piece of land, it means that by your own right, you create shelter for yourself and you create property upon that land, and your property then encloses a territory which you have the absolute right to, the only claim to, so that if any other seemingly claim of authority figure tries to then come in and violate your claimed rights to that territory, which is encompassed by your property, by your allodium, if you acknowledge their claim, you acknowledge their authority, You acknowledge their right to do that. It is not your allodium. And there's another phrase called allodial title. So everyone who thinks they own land, or even most property, they don't actually own it. They rent it because they pay taxes, and if they don't pay taxes, they lose their right to that property. The exceptions are religious establishments in the United States and sort of elsewhere, and royals. So the royalty and the religious institutions have allodial title to their property and don't owe any taxes to it. Yet allodial title to property does not mean that property is their allodium, because that title, if it's registered with another authority, means they acknowledge that other authority as their overlord, even if they don't have to pay a fee for taxes to that overlord. They have to pay fealty insofar as acknowledging the authority of that authority system wherein they register that allodial title. So there are very few examples of allodia, which is the plural of allodium, in the world. One of them is the Vatican. So the Vatican has been an allodium for a long time and has been owned absolutely by the church, or the head of the church, the Pope, and they don't owe any taxes to anyone else, nor have they registered their allodial title with another authority, and so they are their own sovereign state, enclaved within the state of Italy. San Marino is another example. I'm not sure how of an allodium, or of an enclave, a sovereign state enclave within Italy, that I think it relates to the concept of allodium, but I haven't done enough research. But it's the oldest republic in the world, and it's an enclave in Italy. And I think it all kind of... Anyways, I'm going to drop that tangent. And so that's what an allodium is. Hopefully I've described that well enough. So one more thing. So can your property become your allodium? Yes, it can. How does, say your vehicle, you think your vehicle is your property. Say you've paid off the debt to your vehicle and you think you own it absolutely. How could one turn one's vehicle from one's property to one's allodium? Well, is that vehicle licensed? Is the permission for that vehicle's usage been secured via purchasing a license from another authority? Is it registered? Have you registered the authorization of the use of that vehicle with another authority? Has it been inspected? Can you only use the vehicle because of some other authority figure has said that it is up to a certain standard by which the inspector gives you permission to proceed with the various hoops that you have to jump through in order to... So you understand my point. You can't acknowledge an overlord relative to the thing if you want it to be an allodium. And there's trade-offs. There are always trade-offs. When you take responsibility for yourself, you also inherit the risk that is associated with that responsibility. So, for example, my vehicle is my allodium. It's not licensed, it's not registered, it's not insured, it's not inspected. Why would I do any of these things? Why would I sacrifice my allodium for a degree of safety? Those who sacrifice their liberty for the illusion of safety, deserve neither and lose both. I kind of butchered the quote, but it's a quote. It's a truth, and it's also a quote. Butchered quote. So, relative to a house, I established my house. I built a shelter upon land which I did not purchase. I did not purchase permission, or any sort of inspection or license. By my own right, upon the land, I built a shelter. And for the first 6 months or so, that shelter was my property, but it was not my allodium. The shelter became my allodium when I made the mental choice, the realization that only I have a right to my home, my shelter, and not only do I have a right to it, but I have a right and ultimately a responsibility to defend it with my own life should it become necessary. So when I made that choice, the property turned into my allodium, because I was willing, even though I hadn't acknowledged any overlord, I wasn't ready. If someone had come in those first 6 months with force and said, get out of here or we're going to arrest or kill you, I would have gotten out of here because it wasn't my allodium. But once I lived in a state of fear at the same time, because that was the reality. I knew there was potential of threat, and if that threat reached my door, then I would have to flee, the fight or flight response. And so I lived in a state of fear for the first 6 months or so. But when I made that decision, when I realized that I have the right to defend my property, and I will, with my life, then it became my allodium. So that's a good example of the difference between property and allodium. So my home is my allodium. All of my property here is my allodium. It encloses a territory, which could be called a lot of land, which is my allodium. But the land itself is not my allodium. The territory enclosed by my property is my allodium. So it's an important distinction to understand that land is not property. You cannot own land. Land is the property of the earth upon whose back we live, and we utilize the resources upon the land. We build upon the land, and the property we build can be our allodium, but the land itself is not. But the territory which is enclosed, so the rights to land can be one's allodium, but not the land itself, because you can't own the land. The land pre-exists the person and was not created by the person. Property is a result of labor. If you did not create the land through your labor, the land cannot be your property. You can work the land and also exclude any other claim to the land, and then enforce your absolute right, your exclusive right to utilize the land. So you can own those rights absolutely or exclusively, but you can't own the land. It's a very important distinction. Now for the proper noun, allodium. So because this word allodium has been erased essentially from our modern lexicon, our word base that people use, and because I only even found the word through a series of scholarly investigations, hours upon hours upon hours of research before even finding the concept of allodial title. And once I found that, etymologically worked my way backwards to the root of the allodial to find allodium. and then realized that I had already created my allodium, and this is the word that I have now found that is the word description, the defining characteristic of what I have created here. For that reason, the state that I have created in cooperation with others, which is also a nation because it is a group of people with a shared and unique identity, being sovereigns united by the affirmation of truth, rights, and responsibility. It was a state, OG Foundation, and was a state that was my allodium. And then the nation and the country of allodium, well, we'll start with nation. The nation state of allodium was created in cooperation with other sovereigns, and in its genesis, I staked my allodium, my property, which I own absolute right to, and the territory it encloses, the jurisdiction, I staked that to the nation state of allodium. Capital A, proper noun, allodium. It's a nation state. The name of the nation state is allodium. I staked my allodium to the nation state of allodium, and that became the original jurisdiction and territory of the state and nation. And because it has a territory, there's a land associated with it. It's also a country of allodium. And because it was formed out of territory that was formerly claimed by the town of Starksboro, the county of Addison, the state of Vermont, the federal government, and perhaps another bigger thing above that, they lost territory as a result of that action. And they've been on the defensive ever since because the territory has grown. Allodium, capital A, is united, like I said, is bound contractually by an affirmation of truth, rights, and responsibility. That is what constitutes the nation of allodium. The people are the sort of agents, I guess you could say, the sovereigns of allodium. But it's this affirmation that is what constitutes it, what unites the various people into a nation. I will include the link to the affirmation in this video. It's one page, very similar to like the Bill of Rights, which was an addendum to the Constitution of the United States. It was not included in the original Constitution, and even the original Constitution wasn't the original Constitution of the United States. It was a confederacy, and then they basically, it's all a con, and everything they teach you is a lie. George Washington wasn't the first president, and it didn't start with the Constitution, nor was it formed by the sovereign right of the people. It was just a continuation of the crown rule from Great Britain, with usurpers who decided to place themselves as the new authorities over the previously established crown colonies. That's the story of the first 13 colonies. That is not the story of Vermont. But to try to avoid getting into the uniqueness of the story of Vermont, all I really need to reference is that in the original Constitution of Vermont, the right of all people to form their own state was included in that Constitution because that's what Vermont did out of territory that was previously claimed by other states, primarily New Hampshire and New York, by the authority of the Crown in England. Yet the people, by their own sovereign right, they didn't usurp the authority of the Crown, they rejected it. There's a big difference. They didn't inherit it, they rejected it, and of their own sovereign right, formed their own state of Vermont out of territory previously claimed by these other states, and that is the state that is now known as Vermont. As an independent country for, I think 12 years, 13 years, Vermont was completely unique relative to the other post-colonial states, but they ended up joining the Union as the 14th state for one simple and logical reason, which is that New York was essentially in a state of war with Vermont, and had Vermont not joined the Union, there would not have been peace established, nor would this original right of all people to create their own state been enshrined in the history of this state of Vermont, because Vermont would not have continued to be a state. And I say that without certainty, because it's possible the people of Vermont would have defeated the people of New York, just like they defeated the people of New York under the Crown Authority. So they could have defeated the usurpers under the colonial authority, just like they did the Crown. But the reality of the situation was that the people wanted peace. They didn't want to continue a state of war, and they wanted to live peacefully with their neighbors. And ultimately, a compromise was formed where Vermont joined the Union of States. And the only significant thing it had to change in its constitution was that right that it enshrined in the original Constitution, that all people have a right to create their own state. Because the federal government wasn't going to allow that into their union. They're not going to acknowledge the fact that all people have a right to create their own state, even out of territories claimed by other states, because how are they going to keep order amongst all these states if a bunch of other states keep forming out of those states? It's just too much chaos for them to handle. And it's not just a hypothetical. That happened many different times in Kentucky and West Virginia and all of these different stories of different places where new states tried to form, and they all essentially failed when they tried to do it independently, other than Vermont. Other provinces, territories turned into like provinces that became states through a certain way which was in alignment with the Union of States, aside from Vermont. And then obviously Texas was just gained in a different way. California was just gained by waging war against Mexico, and Hawaii was gained by just betraying the alliance with the Hawaiian people and just taking the land. And Alaska was gained in a different way, and the Louisiana Purchase was a different way. So there's different ones, but Vermont's the only one, other than potentially Texas, that formed its own independent state and then later joined by the authority of the sovereign people, or the sovereigns thereof, because sometimes people confuse the idea of sovereign people. They think it's a collective, a singular collective, as opposed to a bunch of different sovereigns, each person being their own sovereign, and then collectivizing that right, which seems like a stupid distinction, but it's a very important distinction. So the other aspect of Allodium, the nation, that is necessary to understand relative to this video. So there's the affirmation, which unites it as a nation, and then it has a protocol relative to its economic model of currency creation, which incentivizes membership, labor, and reinvestment, as well as having a mechanism for maintaining integrity of the nation. So over time, I'm going to make better videos. They're going to be higher quality, more to the point, more succinct. But this is the first one. And if you have any questions, it'll have some links in it. If you have any questions, you can leave the questions commented on the video. Though apparently now I can't even comment on YouTube videos anymore. It seems as if this has been targeted at me. Maybe it's targeted at other people as kind of a form of shadow censorship. not like a strike. I've gotten several strikes on the OG Foundation page. I think 3 or 4 strikes. I'm still in the game here, and but yeah, I don't know. I might not even be able to communicate. So I'll also include the link to Telegram, which is the Rumble of communication. And at some point, maybe I'll put this on Rumble as well, because there's a channel on Rumble. It's just that right now I'm working on a low data stream capacity because Starlink is expensive, even though I have the Starlink thing. If anybody out there with an abundance of money is like, this is a great solution, how can I support this? You could sponsor Allodium in the most kind of bang for your buck way by paying for this Starlink service, so that I can have higher speed internet to upload all of these things. Because everything that I've done here has been without any debt and without any kind of investors. Basically, there have been a few people who have donated small amounts of money, but ultimately I have created everything from scratch, starting from basically nothing, and to the point where now 10 years into OG Foundations, into the 7th year of Allodium, and there are several different residential spaces, as well as a sort of castle facade symbol that is developing. So everything's out in the open. There's a website, there's fees for the website and everything, but I've managed to build all this without any debt and without compromising relative to any other authority figures, at the risk of my life and all of my dependents' life, but with the ultimate intent of destroying the Death Star, defeating the Empire, and there being, hopefully, like getting the princess also, and everyone being free and celebrating, and a golden age of greatness. So it's not just an ideal, but it's a reality that's being worked towards. And in its own way, it exists now in this place of sort of sanctuary and peace and no oppression, where people come and go and find their residence here for a time, and some longer than others. But that's the end of this video, and at some point I'll make some more videos and resources about Allodium, and it'll probably be guided by other people's interest and however I can communicate information effectively to help us together in a companionship achieve results that are symbiotic for us all. But until next time, that's all.